Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
Departure. The fluorescent lights of the terminal hummed, casting a sterile glow on the restless crowd. Statham leaned against a pillar, his posture relaxed but his senses on high alert. He watched the ebb and flow of humanity, the harried families, the stoic business travelers, the nervous students clutching backpacks. Every detail was etched into his memory. A dropped boarding pass, a furtive glance, the way a woman nervously chewed her lip. The air thrummed with anticipation and anxiety. A symphony of unspoken stories. Aisha navigated the security line with practiced ease, her movements fluid and efficient. She wore a simple linen dress and carried a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder. Her dark eyes, intelligent and compassionate, scanned the faces around her, a silent observer of the human drama unfolding in the departure lounge. This trip home wasn't a vacation, it was a mission. The orphanage in Peshawar needed her. Funds were drying up, and the children were relying on her. Promise she had secured a grant, a hard-won victory after months of relentless work, and now she carried the hope of those children in her heart. Mac Riley shuffled through the gate, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder like a dead weight. The years in service had etched themselves onto his face, a roadmap of hardship and loss. His eyes, once bright with youthful optimism, were now clouded with a deep-seated weariness. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He was going home to a place he barely remembered. A small town in Montana where the mountains met the sky. A letter from his sister had prompted the trip, a plea to help with the family ranch. He wasn't sure he was fit for civilian life, but the promise of open spaces and honest labor offered a sliver of hope. The metallic tang of fear and regret clung to the air around him. He just wanted a quiet flight, some sleep, and a chance to forget. Flight 372 to Dubai was now boarding. The announcement echoed through the terminal. A slow trickle of passengers began to line up. Aisha joined the queue, her gaze fixed on the gate agent. Mac lingered, nursing a lukewarm coffee, his eyes scanning the boarding passengers. Omar Sharif pushed his way through the crowd, a forced smile plastered on his face. He wore an expensive suit and carried a briefcase, projecting an air of confidence that belied the turmoil within. Sweat beaded on his brow as he approached the gate, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was Itno turning back. That he subtly bumped into a woman in a hijab, murmuring an apology. "The pomegranate is ripe," he whispered, almost inaudibly. The woman, without breaking stride, responded, "The Falcon takes flight at dawn." Omar nodded curtly and quickened his pace. Relieved that the exchange was over, he reached the gate and presented his boarding pass. His hand trembling slightly as he handed it to the agent, he forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Statham watched Omar disappear down the jet bridge, his senses prickling with unease. The subtle exchange hadn't escaped his notice. It was too deliberate, too rehearsed. He had learned to trust his instincts, honed by years of covert operations. Something wasn't right. He took out his phone and sent a quick, encrypted message. The wheels were in motion. Now it was a waiting game. Aisha found her seat in the crowded cabin, stowing her satchel under the seat in front of her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to block out the noise and chaos around her. She pictured the faces of the children waiting for her, their hopeful eyes shining in the dim light of the orphanage. Their future was in her hands. Mac settled into his window seat, his gaze fixed on the tarmac. He watched the ground crew preparing the plane for departure, their movements precise and efficient. He felt a strange sense of disconnect, as if he were watching a movie unfold before him. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the memories that haunted him, the faces of the fallen, the screams of the wounded. He just wanted to go home. Omar found his seat near the back of the plane, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around nervously, checking to see if he was being watched. He was just a pawn in a much larger game, a cog in a machine he didn't fully understand. But he had made his choice, and now he had to see it through. Fear gnawed at him as the plane taxied down the runway. Aisha gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. Max stared blankly out the window, his face etched with a profound sadness. Omar Sharif closed his eyes and prayed for forgiveness. The engines roared to life, and the plane hurtled down the tarmac, gathering speed.in. The terminal, Statham watched the aircraft take off, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He knew that the real journey was just beginning. Seeds of deception. The internet cafe's buzzing fluorescence reflected the taut anxiety coiling in Omar Sharif's gut. He scanned the message again, each word searing itself into his consciousness. Sunrise confirmed. Seeds ready. May Allah grant you success. It was the signal, the culmination of months spent plotting in shadowy corners. The ever-present dread of exposure a constant companion. The operation was greenlit, ****. 6 weeks prior, an Islamabad warehouse on the city's edge. The air, thick with the aromas of dust and cheap fuel, vibrated with Abu Nazir's sermon. Before a clutch of attentive men, his face a crinkled map of zealotry, he gestured towards a world map, a web of jet routes etched across its surface. Operation Nightingale, he croaked, his voice roughened by years of fervent pronouncements. A festering symbol of Western immorality. We strike at the heart of their arrogance. His finger jabbed at a point over the Atlantic. Flight 416, London to New York. Maximum occupancy. A perfect target. Omar recalled the crushing weight of that moment. The clammy slick of his hands. Nazir's gaze had locked onto his. A silent, unavoidable demand. You are the chosen instrument, Omar. You will cultivate the seeds of our holy retribution. The details followed in rapid succession. Ingeniously disguised components, clandestine communication protocols, relentless training exercises. A constant barrage of justification. He forced the memories down. Self-doubt was a burden he could ill afford. *****. Omar snapped his laptop shut, the screen's afterglow fading. Drawing a long breath, he fought to steady his restless hands. He settled his bill, stepping out into the clamorous Islamabad street. The air tasted of exhaust and fragrant spices. He flagged a cab toward the airport. His backpack a leaden weight against his shoulder blades. Boarding descended into a swirl of motion, families jockeyed, executives barked orders into smartphones. A mingled cloud of perfume and kerosene hung in the air. Omar located his seat, 27B. A window spot toward the rear. He hoisted his bag into the overhead compartment and settled in. His pulse a frantic drumbeat. He tried to focus on the pre-flight safety briefing, but the attendant's movements seemed dreamlike, detached from reality. *****. Aisha Khan offered a warm smile to the young girl beside her. The child, perhaps 7, clutched a well-loved teddy bear, her eyes wide with anxiety. A little nervous, Aisha inquired gently, her voice a soothing balm. The girl nodded, her lip trembling. It's all right, Aisha reassured, taking the child's hand. Flying is a great adventure. We'll soar through the clouds, like birds in the sky. She gestured to the window. Look, you can see the world from up high. The child's grip on the bear eased slightly, a hesitant smile gracing her lips. Aisha's research grant, destined to add a new wing to the Peshawar orphanage, felt substantial in her satchel, a tangible reminder of the hope she carried. *****. Across the aisle, Marcus Mack. Riley observed the embarkation with weary detachment. Years immersed in the darker aspects of humanity had imbued him with cynicism, yet sharpened his intuition. He trusted his gut, an instinct honed in the world's most dangerous locales. His gaze lingered on the young man in 27B. Omar. He sat too still, too contained. There were no nervous tics, no glances at his phone. Not even a casual look around. Just an unnerving, almost statue-like quality. Mac's attention drifted to the backpack above. The way it had been stowed, too precise, too deliberate, triggered alarm bells. Mac reached for his flask. He needed a buffer. He'd seen too much, done too much, just wanted to make it to New York, see his sister, and maybe find some oblivion. But the young man's composure wouldn't let him rest. Suspicion, like a newly planted seed, had taken root. Turbulence. The seatbelt light died, its incessant chime finally a memory. A wave of exhales swept through the cabin. Omar Sharif, pinned to the window in 23A, tugged at his tie. The silk now felt like a strangling hand. He checked his watch. 2:17 p.m. Impeccable timing. Up front, a clumsy passenger unleashed a geyser of orange juice down a businessman's immaculate shirt. Good God! He roared. leaping up, mortified. The apologetic woman dabbed ineffectually with a flimsy napkin. "I'm so dreadfully sorry." Omar, however, barely noticed. He was attuned to the burgeoning tension, the atmosphere thickening like a gathering storm. The carefully planned sequence was unfolding that a shrewish voice shattered the murmurs of consolation and annoyance. "You think you can bully me like that?" A woman, face twisted into a mask of outrage, stabbed a finger at the man across the aisle. "I saw you. You deliberately impeded me from stowing my bag." He scoffed derisively. "Don't be absurd that my back is acting up. I was merely trying to—" "Don't you dare lie!" she shrieked, her voice climbing the scales, head swiveled, initial amusement curdling into apprehension. The argument intensified, fueled by the pressurized cabin and unspoken anxieties. A cacophony of accusations filled the air. Omar observed the burgeoning conflict with a detached, almost scientific interest. Phase 1. Nominal success. His gaze drifted towards the flight attendant, Fatima, as he knew her navigating the aisle with a beverage cart. Her composure was absolute, her smile unwavering, her movements fluid. Decades had passed since the Bekaa Valley. Yet time seemed to have forgotten her. As she reached the bickering couple, she paused, feigning an offer of refreshment, reaching for bottled water. Her fingers brushed the cart's edge, dislodging a tiny silver trinket, a miniature scimitar, that winked once under the lights before vanishing beneath the seats at a signal. Unambiguous and precise. Point 2 rows behind. Statham tensed, every nerve. Screaming, spilled drinks, escalating disputes. He recognized the pattern, countless repetitions, a classic misdirection. A meticulously crafted smokescreen and icy premonition settled deep in his gut. He surveyed the passengers, searching for dissonances. The jerky movements of a youth near the emergency exit, another's furtive glances at the cockpit, the unnaturally fixed nature of Fatima's smile. Insignificant alone. Together they formed a chilling mosaic. His eyes met Fatima's for a fleeting instant. The warmth had vanished, replaced by a glacial hardness. He glimpsed recognition, a spark of challenge. Before she looked away, Statham's pulse hammered. He understood, he knew what was coming. He subtly freed himself from his seatbelt, muscles coiling. He needed a strategy, and he needed it now. The aircraft's confines offered little escape. He was ensnared, surrounded by innocents, with a team of highly trained operatives poised to unleash hell. The argument raged on, the woman now branding the man a pig. The din was overwhelming, the perfect backdrop for impending bedlam. Omar Sharif inhaled deeply, his hand delving into his carry-on. The hour had arrived. He felt the crushing weight of responsibility, the burden of his convictions, the heft of the weapon within. He closed his eyes briefly, visualizing the faces of family, comrades, the wronged he vowed to avenge. His eyes snapped open, focused like a laser on the cockpit door. The time was now. Statham watched him, a primal alarm, blaring in his mind. Time had run out. Taking control. The overhead compartments burst open with an ear-splitting clang, amplified beyond normalcy at a man, until a breath ago lost in the well-worn pages of his book. Wrestled his bag down with a violent jerk. He rummaged inside. Not for the expected tech or travel pillow, but for something far more menacing. A flash of cold steel punctuated the muted cabin lights. A compact handgun. He snapped out an order in Arabic, the harsh syllables shattering the aircraft's steady drone. Across the narrow passage, another passenger, who had been play-acting at sleep, mimicked the maneuver. Then another, and another, each producing a weapon from luggage that had seemed utterly innocent. The recirculated air, already stale, pressed down like a shroud. A shriek tore from the back of the aircraft. Instantly infectious panic bloomed, spreading like a toxic gas. Aisha clutched her aged leather satchel. Within it, the fragile promise of survival for the orphanage she championed. Her heart hammered a frantic tattoo against her ribs, a desperate rhythm against the rising tide of dread. She murmured a silent plea, her gaze flickering between the armed men and the sea of horrified faces around her. "Silence!" the lead hijacker roared, his English bearing a noticeable accent. Yet perfectly clear. He brandished his gun, instantly quelling the screams, leaving only suppressed whimpers and stifled gasps in their wake. This aircraft is now under our control. Compliance is your only path to safety. Mac Riley, positioned near the emergency exit, remained unmoved as he'd weathered far worse squalls. The jagged scar slashing across his left brow pulsed with a dull throb, an echo of the chaos brewing within him. His eyes, sharpened and assessing, charted the landscape of the cabin. Point 4 visible, possibly more lurking unseen. He catalogued their positions, weapon choices, and telltale nervous fidgets. The ringleader, a gaunt man with a face like sharpened flint, seemed the most volatile. Another, thick-bodied and perspiring freely, held his weapon with a shaky hand. Rank amateurs. Dangerously so. "We need access to the cockpit," the leader barked, shoving terrified passengers aside with the unforgiving snout of his weapon. His cohorts followed, bulldozing their way forward, towards the presumed sanctuary behind the reinforced door. Omar Sharif felt the reassuring weight of the Walther PPK nestled amongst his personal effects. His fingers tightened instinctively around the grip. Patience. He needed to analyze the situation. Seek out the opportune moment. Hasty action had been a costly teacher. In his past, he observed the hijackers, his expression an unreadable mask, concealing the tempest raging beneath. The cockpit door, typically a reassuring symbol of inviolability, became the epicenter of the unfolding nightmare. The leader hammered on the metal, bellowing, "Open this door immediately, or we commence the executions." A muffled response filtered out from within. A tense, hurried exchange followed, barely audible above the growing cacophony in the cabin. Then, a sickening thud, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. A collective intake of breath swept the length of the plane. The door lurched inward. Point 2 of the hijackers surged inside, vanishing from sight. The leader lingered in the doorway, his eyes like shards of ice as he raked the passengers, challenging anyone to defy him. The heavy-set accomplice stood sentry in the aisle, his face glistening with sweat, his weapon trembling almost imperceptibly. Statham, seated toward the plane's front, leaned back, projecting an air of calculated nonchalance. Behind the facade, his mind raced. A complex calculation taking form. Point 4 accounted 4.1 at the head, 2 within the cockpit, and the heavy one barricading the aisle. Contingencies existed. He needed confirmation. He needed a strategy. A premature move could be catastrophic. The fate of everyone on board hung precariously in the balance. He subtly adjusted his posture, steeling himself. The quiet before the thunder. The price of resistance. A metallic gleam sliced through the cramped space between seats in row 14. Omar Sharif, looking more like a tax auditor than a rebel, had finally acted. He surged forward. A makeshift shank, Mac assumed it was a toothbrush, honed to a point aimed for the jugular of the aisle guard. The hijacker, a sinewy figure with eyes like frantic sparrows, proved surprisingly agile. He dodged the thrust, a sharp backhand cracking against Sharif's face. The improvised weapon skittered across the floor. Before Sharif could regain his footing, the hijacker smashed the rifle stock against the back of his skull. A dull thud resonated through the pressurized cabin. Sharif went down. The hijacker, chest heaving, stood over Sharif's unmoving form, delivering a series of brutal kicks to his torso. Each blow landed with a guttural grunt. A raw expression of rage. Passengers gasped, shrinking back in their seats, Mac's fists clenched, fingernails biting into his palms. "Anyone else?" The hijacker spat, his voice a grating hiss. "Anyone else feeling heroic?" Silence. A heavy, fear-soaked stillness. The hijacker expectorated on Sharif's prone body and straightened, rifle brandished high. His gaze swept the cabin, a challenge in his eyes, daring someone to rise. Aisha Khan, her face drained of color but her resolve unbroken, squeezed past the paralyzed occupants of row 15. She knelt beside Sharif, disregarding the crimson stain blooming on the carpet. Her fingers, usually employed in comforting frightened children, delicately examined his head wound. "He needs help," she stated, her voice remarkably firm. "He needs medical attention." The hijacker barked out a laugh, devoid of warmth. "We're all the medics you need now, lady, and our cure is pain." He lashed out with his foot, a dismissive act of cruelty. Aisha winced, but stood her ground. Mac watched Aisha's courage, a knot of admiration and frustration tightening in his stomach. He wanted to shout at her, to tell her to retreat, to not jeopardize herself for a lost cause. But he remained rooted to his spot, haunted by specters that always materialized when violence erupted. Ghosts of Kandahar, errors in judgment, faces he had failed to protect. He noticed the tremor in Aisha's hands as she tried to stanch the flow of blood. That he saw the tears gathering, not for herself, but for the fallen man. That he saw the unwavering empathy in her eyes, the same care she lavished on the orphans under her charge. That he also registered the cold calculation in the hijacker's gaze as he observed Aisha. This wasn't merely about dominance. It was about breaking their spirit, extinguishing their hope. The hijacker jerked his head toward the front of the aircraft. "Take him," he snapped at another hijacker who had been observing the scene. "Shove him in the head. Let him contemplate his bad choices." Two hijackers hauled Sharif towards the forward lavatory, his body dragging against the seats. Aisha trailed behind, her face a mask of worry as the lavatory door slammed shut, imprisoning Sharif in its cramped confines. Aisha turned back to the passengers. Her eyes locked with Max. He recognized the silent plea, a desperate call for assistance. One he couldn't ignore. He averted his gaze, jaw clenched. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a hypothetical situation. This was reality. People were being injured. People were going to perish. No superhero was going to swoop down and rescue them. This was his burden now. Statham, observing the brutal scene from his seat further back, felt a chill permeate his core. The wanton cruelty, the absolute lack of regard for human dignity, it was a different order of depravity. These were more than just embittered extremists. They were something far more sinister. He had underestimated the situation. He needed a plan. And he needed it immediately. The stakes had just escalated. First strike. The serving cart, laden with half-eaten meals and discarded newspapers, rattled down the aisle. It was an accident, of course. A sudden jolt of turbulence. That was the story. But the way Statham gripped the handle, the barely perceptible shift in his weight, telegraphed a different truth entirely. The cart slammed into the lead hijacker, the one dragging Omar Sharif towards the lavatory, with a sickening thud. Plates shattered, food splattered, and the man, caught completely off guard, stumbled back, momentarily losing his grip on Sharif. "Sorry," Statham called out, his voice laced with false sincerity. "So clumsy." The hijacker, face contorted with rage, roared something guttural in Arabic and lunged. Statham was ready. He'd anticipated the move, using the momentum of the cart to spin himself around, slamming the edge of the metal frame into the man's temple. Not enough to kill, but enough to disorient. Aisha Khan gasped, scrambling back against the seats, her eyes wide with terror. Sharif lay motionless on the floor, a dark stain blooming on his shirt. Statham didn't give the hijacker a chance to recover. He feigned a punch high, drawing the man's guard up, then followed with a brutal kick to the knee. Bone cracked. The hijacker screamed, collapsing onto the floor, clutching his leg. The second hijacker, who had been guarding the front of the plane, charged towards them, pistol raised. "Aisha, get down!" Statham yelled, already moving. He grabbed a discarded blanket from a nearby seat and hurled it at the gunman's face. The blanket momentarily blinded him, giving Statham the precious seconds he needed to close the distance. He launched himself at the hijacker, tackling him around the waist. They crashed into a row of seats, sending passengers scrambling. The gun clattered to the floor. The fight was brutal, close quarters, a desperate struggle for survival. Statham, despite his superior skill, was fighting for his life. The hijacker was strong, fueled by fanaticism and rage. He clawed at Statham's eyes, bit his ear, and rained down blows with surprising force. Statham managed to land a few solid punches, breaking the man's nose and splitting his lip. But the hijacker wouldn't relent. He wrapped his legs around Statham's torso, squeezing the air from his lungs. Statham felt his vision blurring, his strength waning. He needed to end this now. He drove his elbow into the hijacker's throat. Again and again, until the man's grip finally loosened. Statham rolled him over, straddled him, and pounded his fists into his face until he lost consciousness. He sucked in ragged breaths, his body screaming in protest. He glanced over at Aisha, who was desperately trying to staunch the bleeding from Sharif's wound. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but she continued to work, her brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, a deafening bang echoed through the cabin. Statham instinctively ducked, expecting to be shot. But the bullet hadn't been aimed at him. He looked up to see the hijacker who he had incapacitated was reaching for the fallen pistol, an intense look of rage in his eyes. Before he could line up the shot, Mac Riley, eyes as cold and hard as granite, had shot the hijacker. The bullet ripped through the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling. Mac lowered his weapon, his gaze fixed on Statham. "Took you long enough?" he growled, his voice raspy with disuse. He glanced at Aisha and Sharif, then back at Statham. "More incoming, I reckon. Allies." The impact slammed Statham against the side of the seat, his head swimming. .2 hijackers, furies unleashed, bore down on him. .1 brandished a crude knife. The other, a jagged length of pipe, scavenged, no doubt, from the aircraft's skeleton. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, a cold wave rising in his chest, but he wrestled it down. Giving in wasn't an option. "Think you're some kind of big shot?" the man with the blade hissed, his spittle flying. "You're just postponing the inevitable." Statham deflected a clumsy blow from the pipe, the clang against his forearm sending a shock wave of agony through him. He held his ground. "The only inevitable thing is you two regretting this little trip." A shrill whine cut through the pandemonium from the direction of the cockpit, the emergency beacon blaring its distress. The pilot, bless his soul, had managed to transmit a signal, a slender thread of hope in the encroaching despair. Across the aisle, Mac, previously immobile, shed his statue-like stillness. His eyes, usually veiled, now shone with laser focus. A near imperceptible nod towards the back of the plane spoke volumes. He was strategizing. Good. Statham knew soloing this fight was a fool's errand. He needed reinforcements. "Anyone willing to lend a hand?" he bellowed, his voice roughened by the earlier scuffle. "These lowlifes aren't going to win." Aisha, pale but determined, continued her efforts to staunch Omar Sharif's bleeding, his lifeblood staining the makeshift bandage torn from her headscarf. "He's losing too much," she called out, her voice tinged with desperation. "I need to slow the flow. Can you keep them busy for a while? Time is a luxury we can't afford." A scattering of hesitant glances met Statham's. A young businessman, his suit rumpled and glasses askew, swallowed hard and raised a trembling hand. A middle-aged woman, her face a mask of fear, yet with sparks of defiance in her eyes, gave a decisive nod. A brawny construction worker, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists, shifted in his seat, preparing for action. "All right, listen closely," Statham commanded, his voice low but firm. "We need to use our brains. They have hardware. We have numbers." He glanced at Mac, who was dissecting the hijackers' movements with the gaze of a seasoned hunter. "Mac, spot anything we can turn into an advantage." Mac grunted, his gaze sweeping the cabin's confines. "Overhead luggage, oxygen canisters, anything with heft, anything that cuts." Aisha, still focused on Sharif, offered, I might have something. It's a gamble, but..." She paused, then continued, her confidence growing. "I'm a biochemist. I know the body's vulnerabilities, pressure points, nerve clusters. If we can target those areas, we could disable them without fatal harm." Statham arched an eyebrow. "Pressure points? You positive?" "It's our best shot," Aisha asserted. "I need to get in close. And I need a distraction." "Understood," Statham replied, a plan coalescing in his mind. "Mac and I will create that diversion. We'll draw their venom. The rest of you," he addressed the fledgling resistance, "be ready to pounce. When the opportunity arises, seize it." "Got it." A wave of nervous nods spread through the ranks. Fear lingered, but now mingled with resolve. The cabin's atmosphere had subtly changed. The hijackers might control the vessel, but they no longer held sway over the passengers' spirits. Statham drew a deep breath. Pushing past the throbbing in his arm, he exchanged a charged look with Mac, a silent accord passing between them. Time to push back. He ripped the headrest from the seat in front, testing its feel in his hand. It was insufficient, but it would have to do. "Okay," he murmured, barely audible. "Let's give these sons of bitches a nasty surprise." Breaching the cockpit, Statham melted back into the press of bodies shuffling toward the lavatories. A phantom in the turbulence, Omar, his face slick with sweat, pushed against him, a shaky hand gripping Statham's arm. "They'll see you," he hissed, his voice a strained rasp. "They're watching the aisles," Statham countered, his own voice low and even. "Nobody expects a thing in the can." He peeled Omar's hand away, his eyes conveying a silent promise. Aisha, her face pale but resolute, knelt beside Omar, tearing strips from a linen napkin. The crimson stain blooming on his shirt was spreading rapidly. "Hold this tight," she instructed, pressing the makeshift bandage against his side. Her voice trembled, but her hands were surprisingly steady. "Mac, keep an eye on him." Mac, perched awkwardly on the armrest of a nearby seat, his gaze fixed on the two hijackers guarding the aisle, grunted in acknowledgement. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that mirrored the unease churning in the cabin. "Showtime?" he muttered. A grin set to his jaw. Statham locked himself in the cramped lavatory. The metallic tang of disinfectant stung his nostrils. He ripped the flimsy mirror from the wall, the cheap plastic frame cracking in his grip. He needed a distraction. Something big, something loud. He rummaged through the meager supplies, his fingers brushing against cotton swabs, tiny plastic cups, and finally, a small first-aid kit. An idea, reckless but potentially effective, sparked in his mind. He dumped the contents of the kit onto the counter. Antiseptic wipes, bandages, a small tube of antibiotic ointment, and a vial of saline solution. Outside, Aisha, her voice surprisingly clear, called out, "I need help. He's losing too much blood." The nearest hijacker, a burly man with a cruel scar bisecting his cheek, hesitated. Omar groaned theatrically, adding to the chaos. The hijacker glanced towards his partner, who remained impassive, his eyes scanning the passenger's Scarface. However, couldn't ignore the urgency in Aisha's voice. He took a step towards her. That was Mac's cue. He feigned a coughing fit, hacking loudly, and stumbled into the aisle, bumping deliberately into Scarface. "Sorry, mate," he rasped, clutching his chest. "Just a touch of turbulence." Scarface shoved him roughly aside. "Watch it, old man." Mac, his face contorted in a grimace, used the opportunity to subtly shift his position, placing himself between Scarface and the cockpit door, his hand, hidden in the folds of his jacket, tightened around the heavy wrench he'd liberated from the galley. Inside the lavatory, Statham poured the saline solution into one of the plastic cups. He then squeezed the tube of antibiotic ointment into the cup, adding a liberal dose of antiseptic wipes. That he stirred the concoction with a cotton swab, creating a milky, viscous fluid. He took a deep breath and threw the mixture against the smoke detector. The small lavatory instantly filled with a thick, acrid smoke. The alarm blared, a piercing shriek that cut through the rising panic in the cabin. The second hijacker, finally roused from his vigilance, barked orders in Arabic. Scarface, momentarily distracted by the alarm and the commotion surrounding Omar, turned back towards the cockpit, shouting something unintelligible. Statham burst from the lavatory, a blur of motion that he slammed into Scarface, using the hijacker's momentary disorientation to his advantage. The impact sent Scarface stumbling backwards, crashing into the drinks trolley. Bottles shattered, sending shards of glass and the sweet scent of alcohol into the air. Mac, seeing his opportunity, charged forward, swinging the wrench in a wide arc. Connected with Scarface's temple with a sickening thud. The hijacker crumpled to the floor. The second hijacker, his eyes wide with fury, raised. His weapon, Mac, despite his age and injuries, moved with surprising speed, diving for cover behind a row of seats. Bullets ripped through the air, tearing into the seat cushions. Statham, ignoring the gunfire, sprinted towards the cockpit door. He grabbed the handle. His knuckles white with effort. It was locked. He slammed his shoulder against the reinforced metal, once, twice, the force of the impacts reverberating through his body. The door shuddered but held. He knew he only had seconds. Emergency. Landing. The leader's eyes, black pits of fanaticism, widened as Statham appeared at the other end of the aisle. A guttural roar ripped from the hijacker's throat as he charged, a curved blade flashing in his hand. Statham didn't flinch. He used the narrow space to his advantage. Meeting the attack head-on, the hijacker lunged, aiming for Statham's throat. But Statham sidestepped, a blur of motion, and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with brutal efficiency. A sickening crack echoed in the confined space. The blade clattered to the floor. The hijacker screamed, a high-pitched, animalistic sound. Statham didn't hesitate. He delivered a swift, precise kick to the man's knee, buckling him as the hijacker crumpled. Statham seized him by the collar and dragged him towards the cockpit door. The other passengers recoiled, their faces masks of terror and hope. Omar Sharif lay slumped against a seat, Aisha Khan frantically pressing a makeshift bandage against his shoulder. Blood soaked through the fabric. Aisha looked up as Statham passed, her eyes wide with gratitude. "He needs a doctor," she gasped, her voice trembling. "He'll get one?" Statham said, his voice low and grim. He slammed the hijacker against the cockpit door, the force of the impact enough to knock him unconscious. He then braced himself, took a deep breath, and punched the access code into the keypad beside the door. The door clicked open. He shoved the unconscious hijacker inside and stepped in after him, quickly locking the door behind him. The pilots, a man and a woman, were pale and shaken, but alive. A bullet hole marred the control panel. "I've secured the cabin," Statham said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What's the situation?" The female pilot, her face streaked with sweat, spoke first. "We took fire, lost some instruments. We've got a hydraulic leak. Landing gear might be compromised. We need to get down now." "Where's the nearest airfield?" The male pilot, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls, pointed to a screen displaying a swirling radar map. "Small municipal airport, about 20 minutes out, runways short, but it's our only option." Statham nodded. "Get us there. I'll stay here until we're on the ground." He spent the next 20 minutes a silent, watchful presence in the cockpit, monitoring the pilots as they fought to keep the crippled plane airborne. He saw the raw fear in their eyes, the beads of sweat tracing paths down their temples, but also their unwavering determination. He said nothing, offering only the occasional nod of encouragement. The descent was a white-knuckle ride. The plane shuddered violently as they approached the small airfield. Statham watched as the pilots wrestled with the controls, their faces grim. He could feel the tension building in the cabin, a palpable force that pressed against him. The wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-jarring thud. The plane swerved, tires screeching, threatening to veer off the runway. Statham gripped the back of a pilot's chair. Bracing himself, he saw the flash of emergency vehicles gathering near the runway, their lights painting the scene in a pulsating strobe. The pilots fought to regain control, their movements a blur of practiced precision. Finally, with a screech of metal and a cloud of smoke, the plane lurched to a stop. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Cheers erupted, quickly followed by sobs of relief. Statham remained in the cockpit, watching as the emergency crews swarmed the plane. "You saved us," the female pilot said, turning to him, her voice thick with emotion. "All of us," Statham simply nodded. "Just glad I could help." He waited until the passengers began to disembark, then slipped out of the cockpit and into the throng. He moved with purpose, his movements fluid and almost invisible amidst the chaos of relieved passengers and emergency personnel. He paused only long enough to exchange a fleeting glance with Aisha Khan, who gave him a grateful nod, her arm still wrapped tightly around Omar's bleeding shoulder. Then he was gone, lost in the sea of faces, swallowed by the crowd. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, Jason Statham vanished, leaving behind only whispers of the man who had saved them all. The evening news would soon be filled with his heroic acts, but he was already gone, moving on to the next crisis, the next shadow, the next fight.